The counters runs in tenths of seconds now instead of just seconds. And it alternatively or randomly switches so that it's off to the side and recording at 90-degree angle, so I'd be laying sideways. Anyway, it's running right now. Okay, chapter 39, lights out. A moment later, curious, frightened, and angry voices erupted as one and destroyed the silence. Questions were hurled at the podium from all directions like Nolan Ryan fastballs. The sheriff held his hand up in the air and asked for quiet. He had asked several times, but finally the crowd quieted back down. Please, one question at a time, the lawman pleaded. He pointed to a man in the front row with his hand up. Yes? Mark could hear the man ask his questions, but the words didn't register on his brain. He felt as if someone had just cut a hole through his chest big enough to drive a truck through. The first two announcements the sheriff had made, while unsettling, weren't unexpected. Mark felt that they were fairly well prepared for large groups of refugees and even some groups of ne'er-do-wells. But how was he supposed to protect his people from a killer virus? He caught himself. His people? Who did he think he was? Moses? Or maybe he'd been listening to Manny and the others too much. He came back to reality in time to hear the sheriff introduce Dr. Ken Phillips to the impromptu council. In addition to having a practice here in Floresville for the last 25 years, Dr. Ken is also our county medical examiner and chairman of the Board of Health. The doctor walked from the back of the room to the podium. Most of you know me. I like to hope for the best, but I also like to be prepared for the worst. I don't think we need to overreact to this illness. We don't know for certain if it even exists, but if it does, and if it's truly a virus, then there's little we can do to stop it if it makes it here from California. However, we have several reasons to be optimistic. First, as I said before, it may only be a rumor. Hopefully we'll know more in the near future. Second, if it isn't a rumor, California is a long way when transportation is as limited as it is in these circumstances. It may never make it here. Lastly, even if it does get here, it may have mutated to a less deadly form by that time. A few others asked some questions, but he wasn't able to tell them much more than what he'd already said. He sat down and Kurt stood back up. The reason we're here is to come up with some responses to these threats. Any ideas? The sheriff asked. Yeah, one man yelled. Let's barricade off all the routes into the county and not let anyone in. A large portion of the crowd seemed to agree with the man. That is something we've considered, the sheriff announced, but there are several problems with this solution. First, the highways through our county belong to all of the people of Texas, not just to us. We can close down the county roads if we want, but it wouldn't be legal to shut off the state highways. Who cares if it's legal or not? This is a matter of survival, the same man yelled at the sheriff. He seemed to be somewhat of a hothead. However, Mark saw many people in the room nodding their heads in agreement with him. I care, and so do my deputies, but even if we tried to stop everyone from entering on the highways, what's to stop them from traveling cross-country? We don't have enough men to completely surround the county. Plus, some will have family and friends here who want to take them in. Others will just want to pass through. Only a small percentage will be troublemakers. We shouldn't punish everyone just because of a few. Mark could see many of the same people nodding their heads in agreement with the sheriff now. Some of them were even saying, that's right. Several other suggestions were made over the next few minutes, but they all presented at least as many problems as they solved. The sheriff suggested they all think about it and have another meeting the same time next week. Everyone seemed agreeable to that, so the sheriff moved to another item. As most of you know, my deputies and I are stretched pretty thin. I've been hopeful the lights would come back on soon and that everything would return to normal. However, it seems the possibility of that is more and more remote with each passing day. There are two groups of people represented here today who have formed what could be described as a citizens' militia. I want to use those groups as prototypes to organize people throughout the county into groups that can help the sheriff's department. Militias are a bunch of skinheads and fat rednecks. We don't need any of them in our county. It was the same hothead as before. Mark didn't know who the man was, but he didn't like his attitude. He did have a point, though. Mark had seen a documentary on militias on CNN after the Oklahoma City bombing. In fact, Timothy McVeigh, the bomber, was part of a militia. Yeah, right. The sheriff took a deep breath. That's not totally true, Barry. While militia has become a dirty word in the last few years, that hasn't always been the case. Militias fought with the colonial army against the British and the American Revolution. Militias made up the forces that fought for Texas independence against Santa Anna. Texas did not have an organized army. It was citizens who'd had enough of unfair rule from Mexico who came together to form an unorganized army that won freedom for our great state. All militia really means is an unorganized group of citizens who come together to help each other. Whether they were fighting tyranny, Indian attacks, or outlaws, they were a militia. If we don't want to call it a militia, we don't have to, but that doesn't change what it will be. A group of Wilson County citizens who want to protect our county from harm. Mark had never heard it explained that way. What the sheriff wanted to do made sense. The first person I want to introduce is Greg Hardy. The sheriff pointed into the crowd and a man stood up. Mark, of course, recognized him as the man who had come out with the lawman and asked him so many questions. Greg lives in Lavernia and has organized his neighbors into quite a force. 4 times they have repelled groups that attacked the town. If not for him and the Lavernia Irregulars, as they call themselves, some of the town's citizens might not be with us today. The group clapped for Greg. He looked embarrassed by the gesture and sat down quickly with a wave of his hand. The sheriff continued. The next person I want to recognize, Mark looked around the room, wondering if he knew the other militia leader, is Mark Turner from Silver Hills. Mark was dumbfounded. He felt himself being pushed up from both sides by Jim and Gunny. His legs somehow straightened and he was standing, as the people around him applauded. He realized he must have looked like a deer caught in the headlights of impending doom. He heard the sheriff go on about how their group had withstood a running gun battle, and how he had helped the preacher, and how they'd saved Ralph Jones and his family from a bunch of hoods just a couple of nights ago. As Mark listened, his surprise slowly turned to anger. Anger that Sheriff Thompson had blindsided him. Anger that these people now thought he was some kind of example for them to follow. Anger that they were clapping and cheering for him like some kind of gridiron legend. He took a deep breath to calm himself and sat down. It seemed an eternity before the applause stopped. What I want to do is to meet with these men and their associates to come up with a plan to train and organize our county force. The sheriff paused. And what I'd like for all of you to do is talk to your friends and neighbors and see how many would be willing to help us out. It'll be strictly voluntary, but the benefits to us all could truly be the difference in life and death. Does that sound good to everyone? Everyone nodded their heads up and down like porpoises at SeaWorld. The sheriff dismissed the meeting and reminded everyone to return next week, and then asked a few people to accompany him to his office to discuss a training plan. On the way there, Mark pulled the lawman off to one side. You blindsided me, Kurt. I didn't want to be a part of this. I'm sorry. I was afraid if I told you what I really wanted, you wouldn't show up. I can see now I was probably right. Mark just glared at him.